The Smurl family haunting in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, is one of the more infamous cases of alleged paranormal activity in the United States. Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their family, moved into the duplex home in 1974 and soon began experiencing disturbing events. Over time, these escalated into what they described as attacks that were both physical and psychological. The family reported foul smells, strange noises, shaking beds, and even incidents of physical harm. In response to these intense claims, Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators, visited the home and investigated the case. The Warrens reported sensing a powerful and malevolent presence within the house, which they identified as a demonic entity. Their involvement brought significant media attention to the Smurl haunting, sparking both public intrigue and skepticism. Despite attempts to cleanse the house, including multiple exorcisms, the Smurl family claimed that the supernatural disturbances continued, making it one of the most widely discussed hauntings of its time. As the disturbances in the Smurl home escalated, the family found themselves trapped in an unending cycle of terror. Ordinary moments turned sinister. Lights flickered without warning, shadows danced across walls, and whispers filled empty rooms. Jack and Janet tried to shield their children, but the entity seemed to grow bolder. Physical attacks became more frequent and violent, leaving scratch marks and bruises that seemed to appear from nowhere. Desperate for relief, the Smurls turned to their local church, hoping that faith might bring them peace. Several priests attempted blessings, but each effort seemed to provoke the spirit further. The scent of rotting flesh would fill the air during these ceremonies, and icy drafts would sweep through the room, as if in retaliation. The family's exhaustion grew, fueling tensions and testing their resolve. Word of the haunting spread, drawing the attention of the media and local skeptics who labeled the Smurls as attention seekers or mentally unstable. This skepticism only deepened their sense of isolation yet. For Jack and Janet, the entity's presence was undeniable. They could feel its oppressive energy in every corner of their home, a sensation that seeped into their very bones. Then, in a final bid to free their home from the grip of darkness, they reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren. The renowned demonologists arrived with a team, armed with holy relics and recording equipment. They set up in the house, intent on capturing any trace of paranormal activity. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, claimed she could feel the entity's anger, describing it as malignant and ancient. Over the course of several nights, the Warrens recorded strange voices, unexplainable temperature drops, and dark, flickering shapes moving across their cameras. One night, as Lorraine attempted to communicate with the spirit, the entire room grew colder, and an unearthly groan echoed through the walls, as if the house itself were alive. But despite their efforts, each exorcism failed to rid the Smurls of their unwelcome guest. In the wake of the failed exorcisms, the Smurl family grew more desperate. The house seemed to pulse with anger, the air thick with a sense of dread that never lifted. Even as they tried to go about their daily lives, the entity's torment was relentless. Objects would fly across rooms, dark figures lurked in the corners, and disembodied voices hissed threats and obscenities into their ears. Nighttime became unbearable. Jack and Janet lay awake, listening to the sinister, scratching sounds that seemed to crawl up through the walls, as though something were trying to claw its way out. Their daughters, who had once been full of laughter, now cried themselves to sleep, terrified of the shadows that seemed to watch them from every corner. Even the family dog would bark and whimper, cowering in fear at invisible forces that only it could sense. One evening, as Jack sat alone in the living room, the temperature plummeted suddenly, and a nauseating stench filled the air, a smell like rotting meat and sulfur. Frozen with fear, he felt an icy hand grip his shoulder, squeezing so tightly that he gasped in pain. He turned, but there was no one there, only a dark, unnatural coldness that seemed to seep into his skin. Shaken, Jack confided in Janet, but she had already felt the entity's touch herself. She described the sensation as an invisible weight pressing down on her chest, leaving her breathless and weak. With each passing day, the Smurls felt themselves unraveling, physically and mentally. The entity's power appeared to be growing, feeding off their fear, anger, and exhaustion. The Warrens, too, felt the toll of the case. Lorraine sensed the presence of not just one, but multiple spirits within the home. Some, she said, were trapped souls, but there was something darker among them, a single malevolent force commanding the others. Ed and Lorraine began delving into the history of the house and the land it sat on, hoping to uncover clues about the entity's origin. They found whispers of tragic deaths and violent acts from the past, though no one knew if these events had any connection to the current haunting. But as the Warrens dug deeper, they encountered fierce resistance. Equipment failed without explanation. Recordings became warped with unsettling static, and Lorraine experienced disturbing visions, flickers of flames, anguished faces, and hands reaching out from the darkness, as if to pull her under. Each time they attempted to cleanse the house, the entity retaliated with new ferocity, making it clear it would not leave without a fight. One night, determined to confront whatever was tormenting the Smurls, Ed and Lorraine gathered their team in the basement, where the atmosphere felt thick with an oppressive energy. They set up candles and relics, preparing for a ritual meant to drive out the evil force. But just as they began, the basement lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The darkness in the basement was complete, as though it had swallowed every bit of light. Ed tried to reassure the team, his voice steady but tense. Lorraine closed her eyes, focusing on the entity, trying to connect with whatever force held the Smurl family in its grip. The temperature dropped so drastically that their breath became visible, curling like smoke in the stagnant air. The candles, which should have been their only source of light, sputtered and flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Then, a low growl echoed from the far corner, filling the room with a sound that was neither animal nor human. The team held their breath, fear tightening their throats as the growl grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into their bones. Lorraine could feel the hatred radiating from the entity, a raw and primal rage that seemed to take physical form, pressing down on them like an immense, crushing weight. The growl stopped, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. But before anyone could react, a powerful force slammed into Ed, sending him sprawling backward into the wall. He struggled to catch his breath, but it was as if invisible hands were pressing on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Lorraine reached out to him, but her arm felt as if it were being held back, bound by an unseen force that pinned her in place. At that moment, Jack and Janet, who had been listening anxiously from the top of the basement stairs, heard a loud, shattering crash. They rushed down, only to find the team members scattered across the floor, their equipment strewn around them. Jack and Janet helped Ed and Lorraine to their feet, their faces pale with fear and determination. It was clear to everyone that this entity was not a restless spirit, it was something far darker, something that thrived on chaos and suffering. In the days that followed, the activity in the Smurl home reached a fever pitch. Doors slammed shut on their own, pictures flew off the walls, and the air became filled with a deep, guttural laughter that taunted the family relentlessly. Janet awoke one night to find herself paralyzed, unable to move or cry out, as a shadowed figure hovered above her, whispering vile threats in a language she couldn't understand. Realizing they couldn't endure this much longer, the Smurls sought help from every possible source, reaching out to experts, priests, and even skeptics, desperate for a solution. The family was on the brink of collapse, exhausted and fearful for their lives, as they sensed the entity's malevolent energy growing, threatening to consume not just their home, but their very souls. Then, late one stormy night, a local priest, moved by their pleas, agreed to perform a final exorcism. The Smurls gathered in the living room, clinging to each other as the priest began his prayers. But as the Latin incantations filled the room, an unnatural wind swept through the house, blowing open cabinets, knocking over furniture, and extinguishing every light. For a moment, everything was silent, and the family dared to hope that the ritual had worked. But just then, the air grew thick with the stench of decay, and a voice, low and mocking, echoed through the house, whispering a promise that filled their hearts with dread. The mocking voice lingered in the air, its words indistinct but filled with a venomous intent that sent chills through everyone in the room. The priest gripped his crucifix tighter, sweat beading on his forehead as he continued the prayers, his voice trembling but unwavering. He was determined to finish the ritual, to drive out whatever dark force clung to the Smurl family. But the air grew heavier, pressing down on everyone, as if the house itself were alive, breathing with malicious intent. Suddenly, Janet let out a scream. She felt something icy slide across her arm, invisible but as tangible as a clawed hand. Dark bruises formed in its wake, trailing up her arm and stopping just below her shoulder. Jack lunged forward, trying to pull her away from whatever unseen force held her, but a violent gust knocked him back, pinning him to the floor. He felt an intense, searing pain as invisible claws raked across his chest, leaving 3 jagged red marks. The priest's voice grew louder, his Latin chants echoing through the house, challenging the entity that seemed determined to hold its ground. Lorraine, her face pale and eyes focused, felt an intense presence moving around them, circling like a predator stalking its prey. She reached out mentally, her clairvoyant senses straining, trying to understand what this entity wanted. But all she felt was an overwhelming void, a consuming darkness that offered no answers, only more fear. Just then, the floorboards began to shake, and a low, rumbling sound filled the room, like a distant thunderstorm. The walls seemed to close in, pulsing as if the house itself were alive. Family portraits shattered, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor, and an oppressive cold filled the room, numbing their fingers and sending a painful ache through their bones. But through the chaos, Lorraine caught a glimpse of something in her mind's eye, a flash of a distant past, a shadowed figure, cloaked in darkness, bound to the land itself. It was a presence born of rage and suffering, tied to this ground by an ancient wrong that had never been righted. Her voice trembled as she shared her vision with the others, urging the priest to continue, but warning him that this would not be an ordinary exorcism. The entity wasn't bound to just the house, it was bound to something much older, something deep within the earth itself. As the priest renewed his efforts, his voice hoarse but resolute, the lights flickered one last time, and the shadows around them grew darker, as if absorbing every trace of light. Then, in a final, desperate effort, the priest raised his crucifix, commanding the entity to leave once and for all. The room fell silent, the heavy air lifting slightly, giving them a brief sense of relief. But as they took a breath, they heard a slow, echoing knock from deep within the walls, followed by a sinister whisper, "I am not done with you." The whisper sent a chill through everyone in the room. It was as if the walls themselves were taunting them, promising that this was far from over. Jack took Janet's hand, squeezing it tightly as they looked around, hoping against hope that the worst was behind them. But the oppressive atmosphere lingered, heavy and waiting, like a storm about to break. The days that followed were eerily quiet. There were no slamming doors, no shadows darting across the walls, and the foul smells had faded. But the Smurls could sense an underlying tension in the air, like a predator lurking in the dark, watching, waiting. It was an unnatural calm that felt more threatening than the chaos they had endured before. Then, late one evening, as the family sat huddled together in the living room, a sudden scratching sound echoed from the walls, sharp and insistent, like claws raking across wood. It began in one corner, then moved, skittering up and down, seeming to surround them, growing louder and louder until it felt like the walls were closing in. The family jumped to their feet, and Jack shouted, "Leave us alone!" In response, a deep, guttural voice rumbled from the ceiling above them, low and mocking, filled with malice. "You belong to me now," it growled. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled for each other's hands, their breaths ragged and fearful. Just then, Lorraine sensed something new, a presence that hadn't been there before, an echo of some force trying to reach them. She closed her eyes, focusing, trying to tune in. She felt a flicker of warmth and light, something almost like a memory of faint, protective energy, as if someone or something from another time or place were trying to shield them. She opened her eyes, whispering to Ed, "There's something else here, something trying to help," but the dark entity's presence was overpowering, and Lorraine's vision faded, leaving only the malevolent force pressing down on them once again. In a last-ditch effort, Ed decided to try a different approach. He gathered the family and instructed them to hold hands, to focus all their energy on resisting the force, on defying it together. They began to chant prayers in unison, voices trembling but growing stronger with each word. The house seemed to vibrate with their words, the air thick with a tension that could snap at any moment. Then, as they chanted, the scratching stopped, replaced by a deep, echoing silence. For a split second, they thought they might have won. But then, a fierce, bone-chilling wind tore through the room, carrying with it the stench of decay and sulfur. The dark entity erupted with renewed rage, its whispers filling the room, growing louder until they were all but deafening, each voice overlapping with the next, hissing threats and promises of torment. A feeling of dread filled each of them, their hope waning, as if the entity was draining their very will to fight. Yet in the face of this darkness, they held on, clinging to one another. Lorraine felt that flicker of warmth again, a faint glimmer, as if someone or something was still reaching out, still fighting to protect them. She closed her eyes, holding on to that feeling, praying it would be enough to stand against the darkness that had plagued their home, unaware that they were on the brink of uncovering a truth more terrifying than anything they had imagined. As the Smurl family clung to one another, enveloped by the dark presence, Lorraine focused on the faint warmth she'd sensed, feeling that it might hold a key to their survival. She whispered to the family, "Picture yourselves surrounded by light. Imagine it growing stronger, pushing back the darkness." They followed her lead, closing their eyes, envisioning a bright, protective energy surrounding them. The oppressive atmosphere around them seemed to waver, as if the darkness were uncertain or confused. The guttural growls and whispers softened, replaced by a strange silence. But before they could breathe a sigh of relief, the silence was broken by a piercing scream that seemed to come from the very walls, raw and filled with pain. It was not the dark entity but something else, something older, as though another presence had been trapped within the house, forced to suffer in silence all these years. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and cracks appeared in the walls, revealing flashes of what seemed like glimpses of people long gone, faces twisted in terror, caught in moments of despair. Lorraine staggered, clutching her head as a vision overtook her. She saw the land before the house had been built, a dark forest where rituals had been performed, people gathering in secret under moonlight, summoning forces they didn't understand. Their voices echoed in her mind, a desperate chant reaching out to something beyond, something they had hoped would give them power, but which had turned on them, trapping them and all who lived here afterward in its eternal grasp. Snapping back to the present, Lorraine gasped, "The land, it's cursed. This isn't just a haunting, it's a prison. Something ancient was called here, and it's never left. It keeps the souls bound here in torment, feeding off fear and suffering." Jack's face went pale, but he gripped her hand, determination in his eyes. "If this thing is holding people here, we have to try to free them. Maybe then, it'll finally leave us alone." But just as hope began to take root, the dark entity surged back with renewed fury, sensing their intention. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe, and shadows wrapped around them, clawing at their skin, filling their minds with whispers of doubt and fear. Images of their worst nightmares flashed before their eyes, each vision more terrifying than the last. Just then, a brilliant light flared up, as if responding to their unity. Lorraine could feel it, a distant energy, powerful yet gentle, like the spirits of those trapped were lending them their strength. With this newfound courage, the family continued to chant, pushing back against the darkness with every word. The light grew brighter, filling the room, clashing against the shadows in a fierce battle. As the two forces collided, the entity let out an enraged, animalistic howl, its grip weakening, its presence flickering. Lorraine felt the spirits around them reaching for the light, drawn to it as if finally finding a way out. She encouraged them, willing the light to grow stronger, to break through the dark force that had bound them for so long. But even as the entity weakened, it wasn't finished. The entity's rage reached a fever pitch, the walls shaking violently as it fought against the light surrounding the Smurl family. The air filled with shrieks and groans, each one echoing the fury of a force that knew it was losing its grip. Lorraine focused harder, drawing on every bit of strength she had, urging the spirits trapped within the house to follow the light, to break free of the dark entity's control. One by one, the shadows around them began to dissolve, releasing anguished souls into the light. Each spirit's departure weakened the entity further, chipping away at its strength. Finally, only the malevolent force remained, clinging desperately to the house, resisting with every ounce of its dark power. Ed stepped forward, joining Lorraine in prayer, his voice resonant and filled with conviction. Jack, Janet, and their children joined in, their voices growing louder, a united chorus against the evil presence. The entity let out a final, piercing scream, its shape contorting and twisting, fighting to remain anchored in the physical world. But the light was unrelenting, growing brighter until it was blinding, filling every corner of the house. With one last, defiant shriek, the entity was forced back, pulled into the shadows from which it had come. A shockwave of silence followed, so profound that the family could hear their own heartbeats. The air was clear, the oppressive weight lifted. The house was still. The Smurls, shaken but hopeful, looked around, their breaths steadying as they felt the darkness recede. Lorraine exhaled, relief washing over her face. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice filled with cautious optimism. "Whatever held this place, it's finally been set free." In the days that followed, the house remained peaceful. There were no more dark shadows, no more foul smells or sinister whispers. The family felt as though a heavy veil had been lifted, as if sunlight could finally reach the corners that had been cloaked in darkness for so long. For the first time in years, they could breathe without fear. Though the scars of their ordeal would never fully fade, the Smurls had reclaimed their home and their lives. They moved forward with gratitude, forever bonded by the strength they'd found in one another. And though Ed and Lorraine Warren would go on to face many other paranormal cases, the Smurl haunting would remain one of their most harrowing and one of the few where the power of love and unity truly triumphed over darkness. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.